Hello, I'm Pedro Mora with Pacific Media, and now polling. There seems to be a discord between what the citizens want and what the government actually does. 2/3 of nowpolling.ca participants want Canada out of NATO. However, the government is strongly committed to the Atlantic Military Alliance. That's why representative democracy, where we empower a few politicians to decide for all of us, needs to be changed into direct democracy, where all of us can participate on the legislation of foreign policy. David McKee, the president of the Canadian Peace Congress, is touring across Canada, presenting three distinct perspectives of NATO, or what NATO means to Canadians. Here is David McKee.
The first proposal, or position, roughly speaking, is that in a post-Cold War era, NATO is being reformed. It's transforming from a military alliance with a defined geopolitical arena into an institution of global security and international law that is allied with the United Nations. So in this model, NATO is providing necessary resources for humanitarian intervention in the defense of international law. And the focus for peace groups who have such a position often is to work to strengthen that reorientation in NATO policy and activity, and to deepen the links between NATO and the United Nations. The second general argument that you get around NATO is that it's an institution whose raison d'etre, whether or not it was ever legitimate, its raison d'etre has now disappeared with the end of the Cold War. NATO is costly, cumbersome, unfocused, and discredited, and it needs to be dissolved through agreement by its members. And peace activists who have this particular focus tend to feel that Canada should stay a member of NATO, but that it should advance pragmatic and moral arguments for voluntary dissolution of the alliance. And the third position, again, generally speaking, is that NATO is an aggressive institution pursuing a specific objective, that its activities and policies have always been a threat to world peace, and they continue to be. And further, that NATO has a profound effect on its member states, distorting and weakening sovereignty. It cannot be reformed or dissolved voluntarily, and it has to be dismantled piece by piece. And groups that have that position, their focus tends to be to pressure individual states, their states where they live and work, to withdraw from NATO, which increasingly weakens the organization and strengthens alternative visions of sovereignty and independent foreign policy. So with respect to the first proposal, which is that NATO is being reformed into a credible institution of global security, I think the first argument that I would have against this, that we would have against this, is that NATO is a military alliance, first and foremost, and that in itself is a violation of international law. Why? Because the UN Charter allows for regional military alliances, but NATO is not a regional. I mean, the United States argued that NATO was a regional military alliance, but I think it would be the only instance where the Atlantic and countries bordering the Atlantic would be understood as a region. I think it's not a valid argument. So that's the first thing. But that argument is actually, I think, a little bit too simple. Whether or not NATO as an alliance is legal or not is actually a bit simple. And there's other ways to deconstruct this concept that it's a security partner of the UN. There are many problems with the United Nations. I think we could all probably make a big list of issues. How it's been weakened, how it's been distorted, how it's been co-opted. We're all very aware of the problems with the UN. But I think it's important to remember that it remains the main institution of international law. And I think by and large, it's the most democratic institution of international law. When you figure that its covenants and its conventions and its treaties are all discussed and amended through a public process. Contrast this with NATO, which is not an open organization, whose key decisions are confidential, whose membership is not representative of the world states, and whose foundation is not consistent with international law. So the question that comes up when we talk about NATO partnering with the UN is, on whose terms is this partnership really occurring? Is NATO becoming democratic, open, and transparent? Is NATO amending its treaties and policies so that they're consistent with the Declaration of Human Rights or the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights or Economic and Social and Cultural Rights? Or on the Convention Against Torture? Or on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? I don't think we see that. On the other hand, is the United Nations the one that's being reformed or distorted through its association with NATO? Is the UN pressing for diplomatic and political solutions to international crises, or is it rubber stamping acts of war and aggression in the name of humanitarian intervention and outsourcing command of those missions to NATO? Is the UN respecting human rights and the sovereignty of states, or is it providing moral and political cover under the doctrine of responsibility to protect to selective interventions that serve the strategic interests of the US and Western Europe? Is the UN defending the right of people to choose their own path of social development, or is it turning a blind eye while whole societies are forcibly reoriented towards economic interests of powerful countries? The point I'm trying to make is not to blindly support the United Nations, but rather, because I think there is a lot of work to do with democratic and progressive reform in the United Nations. So it's not to blindly support the UN, but it is to suggest that through its deepening association with NATO, the strong points of the UN are being marginalized and weakened, and the problems are being compounded. I think that NATO is in fact not reforming into an institution of international law, but it's using the United Nations as a fig leaf to obscure its real role in the world. Now, with respect to the second proposal, that's the one that NATO needs to be dissolved, but to do this, Canada should remain a member and work internally. On the one hand, yeah, dissolve NATO. The sooner the better. But on the other hand, there's a tactical problem here. NATO is not an open organization. It selects its members, and they have political, financial, and military obligations to the organization. Canada's official dues to NATO amount to about $200 million a year. That's just sort of its member fee, outside of any other, procurement or military spending or whatever money and resources it dedicates to specific missions that NATO has. That's just the entry fee each year is about $200 million. As a member of NATO, Canada accepts Article 5, which, some of you are probably familiar with, maybe you're all familiar with it. It's the famous mutual clause, which essentially compels every member to respond if one single member is attacked. I'm paraphrasing it, but that's the idea. This, an injury to one is an injury to all, kind of an idea. So there's that obligation as well. And these obligations and others would remain in force if Canada, as long as Canada is a member of NATO. There are expectations and obligations on the country, regardless of whether the country is a hawk or a dove within NATO. It's going to be giving that money, and it's going to be assuming the responsibilities of the mutual clause and other responsibilities as well. So I think the goal of complete NATO dissolution is a great one, but the proposal to remain a member while calling for it is somewhat beyond practical. And that is for Canada to withdraw from NATO. So to sort of to argue this position, I want to ask, is NATO a military alliance? Well, yes, it is. But it's more than that. It's a political institution. And it's a political institution with a specific economic underpinning. Structurally, alongside the military command, which is obviously the main command of NATO, you have what's called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, or the PA. And what the Parliamentary Assembly does is provide an ongoing political exchange between NATO and legislators from its the member states. It's explicitly oriented towards government policy, and it works to ensure that legislation and programs are consistent with and facilitate the implementation of NATO's own priorities. And I think here is where the impact of NATO is really most profoundly felt by its member states. We know the impact that NATO has on societies that have been targeted by by acts of war and aggression, but what I think is less discussed in Canada and less known is what is the impact of NATO membership on Canada. And I think it's through this Parliamentary Assembly in particular that we see this. So I thought I'd give some recent examples of political and economic policy that have been framed, at least in part, but in a significant part, through NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, to sort of give you a sense of of this impact. The first is national missile defense. So through the early 2000s, there was, sure we were all engaged in it. I know I was in Toronto, and there was a lot of debate, a lot of lobbying, a lot of mobilization around the question of Canadian support and participation in the U.S. Missile defense plan. And it culminated, I think, in a poll in 2004. The end of 2004, there was a poll that showed that 52% of the Canadian public opposed participation in national missile defense. I mean, that's pretty good, especially when you figure that poll is all the resources that are pushing for a support, and yet, people's opinion still says no. I mean, that's really astonishing and welcome. And so the government announced in early 2005 that it was not going to participate. Now, this is seen at the time, I remember, we saw it at the time as a victory for democracy, a victory for peace. People spoke up, let their view be known, and the government sort of had to sit on its hands. But what was less well known at the time, I think, was that also in 2005, NATO launched its theater missile defense program, which was drawing together these small missile defense efforts into a comprehensive scheme, which was essentially the same program that the United States had proposed that Canada assist with. Only this one was achieved under secrecy and some kind of anonymity because it was done through NATO in this backdoor arrangement. NORAD actually was also kind of a feature of that, but I won't get into that. So Canada has pledged its support for NATO's TMD, theater missile defense, including financial support, although I don't have a financial figure and I don't know if I can find one, but if they have pledged financial support. There's an article from a journal from the Department of National Defense, which actually says, I'll paraphrase, I'm not going to quote it, but it says that the NATO takeover of missile defense through this theater missile defense was a way to deal with the lack of public consensus on missile defense, in particular in Canada and Europe. So much for democracy. So another area where policy kind of really does distort policy that we think that we have is the area of nuclear weapons. And there's two aspects to this issue that I want to talk about. The first is that I think we all, maybe not we all, but I think most Canadians understand that the country is a non-nuclear weapons state. We don't make them, we don't have them here, we don't own them. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about connections between the nuclear industry and the nuclear energy industry and the nuclear weapons industry, and that's there. But I mean, in terms of what is a nuclear weapons state, Canada, is not on the list. However, NATO maintains a first strike policy with nuclear weapons, and it refuses to move from that position despite a lot of criticism, and a lot of criticism from, at the international diplomatic level too. Well, Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is a member of NATO's nuclear planning group, which every member except France is a member of that group. And that group is responsible for developing and maintaining and crafting up NATO's nuclear weapons policy. So essentially, despite policies that individual states might give out that say, well, we're a non-nuclear weapons state, by virtue of being a member of NATO and being at the decision-making table where these policies are crafted and potentially executed, you could argue, and I would, that every country that is a member of NATO de facto has a position of nuclear first strike. So that's the first problem involving nuclear weapons. The second problem involving nuclear weapons is wrapped up with the F-35 fighter procurement. Prior to this announcement by Harper, the issue of the F-35 had begun to appear in reports, committee reports from the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And what were they talking about? Well, those reports, I mean, they aren't minutes, right? Like they aren't, straight up reports of what was said. They're summaries, and they're carefully sanitized summaries. But it's pretty clear. You read them, and you get a sense that there's a lot of concern among the group that the procurement process isn't happening fast enough and big enough, that the funding isn't going to, the project isn't going to be well funded. It's not going to be properly internationalized. This is also kind of important because the United States 2 years prior had this tremendous economic crisis, right? And it was in a very panicky way looking at how to roll back its own military spending in certain areas, but not the overall spending they didn't want to roll back. They wanted everybody else through NATO to pick it up. And this is also referenced constantly in these documents from the Parliamentary Assembly. So you've got this going on at the same time. Alongside this, the United States government comes out with, and I think it was in its nuclear posture review, there's this little piece in there about the B-61 bomb. I didn't know what a B-61 bomb was until a little while ago. It's a nuclear bomb, right? It's a really major nuclear bomb. And what they want to do is they announced in 2010, in this spring, I think the report came out in March or something. They announced that they're going to redesign this B-61 bomb so that it can be carried by the F-35 fighters, which initially were not going to be equipped for nuclear weaponry. I think the term is dual-purpose fighter, but I'm not sure of that. But anyway, initially it wasn't going to carry those, and they roll it out, they spin it, all of a sudden in this big report is this little sentence which says we're going to redesign this bomb so that it can be carried by the F-35. And the rollout date for the B-61 bomb and the rollout date for the F-35 fighter are, you guessed it, they coincide. So I guess the UPS truck will bring both at the same time and will save on shipping costs or something like that. So now you've got this bizarre situation. To me it's bizarre, it's offensively bizarre, where through a non-tendered process, meaning in secret, the Canadian government decides to order $30 billion worth of military aircraft that is being developed through a procurement process that NATO has been pushing on its member states. And in that process, Canada is also funding the upgrading and proliferation of nuclear weaponry, which Canadian military pilots will now be able to carry on the F-35 fighter. To me, that just reeks of danger to me. That there's this secret process which has led to a really profound shift in development in a profoundly different way in Canadian military policy and foreign policy, and that it's involved also taking billions and billions of dollars of public monies away from, child care program, health care spending, job creation, name it, right? I think the approach that's being taken right now to Syria is a concern based on humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect. And the approach that's being taken with respect to Iran is about weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons production. So let's just talk about Syria. So when we say from the Peace Congress and the World Peace Council, when we argue that there should be no intervention, no military intervention from the United States and NATO and their allies in these countries, we aren't saying that we aren't doing that as a way to offer support to particular regimes in Iran or in Syria. And that's important I think that's important to say, because and the same thing happened in 2001 during the invasion of 2003 during the invasion of Iraq, where if you were opposed to the invasion, people would accuse you of being pro Saddam Hussein, which I always thought was kind of a weird, I used to say to people, well, I was always opposed to Margaret Thatcher, but that doesn't make me a sexist man. I mean, like, it might, but it didn't. You know, I mean, that wasn't why I was opposed to her. I was opposed to her because I hated her policies, you know. So I think the same thing. It doesn't necessarily make me a supporter of this person because I think that these policies are terrible. I think it's a question of two things. One is there a struggle going on in Syria and Iran? Yeah, there is, and there's. I think it's a complicated situation, and I don't think there's simple answers. But that struggle is the property of the people who live there, and that doesn't mean that I don't care about what happens, or that we shouldn't care. We should, and I think that the tragedy of this question of responsibility to protect is that I think it plays on really good intentions that people have. You know, most human beings care about other human beings. Most human beings don't want to see people get tortured or displaced or we don't like to see that, and we shouldn't like to see it, and that's why we care, and that's why we're here as activists. But the proposal to have things like no-fly zones, which are essentially just aerial bombardment to neutralize the capacity of a country, or propping up, picking a side and arming them and causing a civil war, or trying to assassinate leaders. And I mean, these proposals are just, they don't help the situation, and in fact, they exacerbate it. What did we see in 1999 in Yugoslavia? What did we see in 2001 in Afghanistan, 2003 in Iraq? We're seeing it in Libya right now. These actions are done in the name of humanitarianism, and in fact, they're just brutal. I mean, I was talking to somebody in Toronto a couple of weeks ago from the Pakistani community there, and she was talking about the drone attacks, the drone bombings in northern Pakistan, which we're gonna target Taliban. And she said, well, they dropped them on schools and hospitals. Like, it's just so without saying that there's nothing wrong in those countries, there's not a struggle that is proceeding. I think our focus needs to be to prevent the country of Canada from using that as a pretext to go to war. The same thing is true in Iran, where the issue is weapons of mass destruction. I think the Iranian government has, at least in translation, I don't speak Farsi, so I don't know what's being actually said, but certainly in translation there's some pretty difficult comments that come out of the Iranian government, there's no question. But those comments about developing, anti-Israel comments, about annihilating a whole country, this kind of thing, they don't come out of a vacuum. I mean, they emerge from a context of policies that throughout that region of the Middle East and Central Asia. And what are those? Well, they have to do with occupations and the whole Palestine question, the question of Golan Heights in Syria. I mean, these are all related issues, and I think really what is necessary in Iran, or in the Middle East in general, and Iran's not in the Middle East, but in the region in general, because the problems that are there emerge from, I think, a very comprehensive and delicate and complicated situation, there needs to be a comprehensive approach to the problem. And those who have an interest in those parties in the region need to be given the opportunity to speak their interest and represent that. But they need to do that in a space that's outside of interference from countries like the United States and France and Britain and Canada and things like this. That's one hand. The other hand is that really all Iran's doing is, when you think of it, all Iran's doing is developing nuclear energy. Now, I'm not in favor of that, but in Canada, I grew up in Ontario, I live in Ontario, 50% of Ontario's energy comes from nuclear power. I used to work in a nuclear power plant when I was in high school, and but I'm not in favor of nuclear energy. I mean, it's weird stuff, right? And there are these lots of research that points to links between, as I said earlier, the energy industry and the weapons industry, and that's true. But it's also true that it's the right of countries to develop their energy needs. I mean, that's, it's one thing to say, that's not the safest thing to do. Look what happened in Japan. That's a legitimate discussion to have. But to say, I got an idea. Let's have a war over this. Let's use nuclear energy as a pretext for invading somebody. And is it really about stopping nuclear energy? I don't believe it. Is it about stopping nuclear bombs? I don't believe that it is. Look at all the countries that have them. Look at the way the United States and NATO behaved at the NPT. They derail it. The NPT is the problem anyway, but just because it sort of accepts this unequal situation. But, so it's hypocritical. And it's really just, I think, an effort to find a pretext for going to war. We look at these movements in the Arab Spring movements. We look at the movements in Latin America over the past few years, where we had just a succession of progressive governments. And again, we can critique them for sure. I mean, they're not perfect, but they were definitely popular and progressive governments that took a number of elections and in Latin America, and really changed the kind of the political discourse in that continent. And we look to those, I think, as ways that, as examples, that people can organize and they're willing to organize and they're able to organize around a goal which is profoundly different than the circumstances that confront them. And I think that's the situation that we have before us with this question, not just this question of NATO, but for tonight, this question of NATO, where is there a necessity to challenge it? Absolutely. Is there an ability for people to organize around it? Yes, there is. Is there hope to change it? Absolutely.
David McKee's optimism seems like an impossible dream, especially when we look at the increasing military budgets and when we see the media bias propagating war as the only solution, with little or no consideration of potential peaceful solutions or negotiations. What can we do? We can prioritize constitutional ideological changes like the Department of Peace suggests on Bill C-373. Or we can focus on the potential abolition of NATO, because it's an instrument of war. Perhaps we can select both. On nowpolling.ca, we can tabulate our consensus to qualify and measure our collective decisions. Once we have those results, we need to tell the government, the politicians, what we want. This little booklet, Perpetual Direct Democracy, published by Amazon.com, gives us a framework of what we could do.